listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're joining me right here on my show, the Intrepid radio program, here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, find out all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio, and also all the places where you can find this show in its audio format. And if you were watching the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel, you'd see just over here on the screen, you'd see that we also have a presence on iTunes and iHeartRadio and Spreaker, which is not up there as a logo graphic, but you get the idea. There's different places to see the show, listen to the show, and you can come over and watch the show. And the best part of watching the show on the YouTube channel is the live chat room, which is already going on right now during this broadcast. Come on over, throw in your 2 cents worth on the show, or just enjoy hanging with the other Intrepids and talking about cars and cattle and sex and other things like that they all talk about. So come on over, enjoy yourself. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, yesterday, we started talking about this whole idea of God, and this idea of God before he was God. Where did the concept come from? Not just the concept of God, but the concept of the kind of God we worship, the kind of religion that we practice. And we're looking into the pre-Assyrian, the Mesopotamian record. Ancient Sumer, ancient Akkad, ancient Mesopotamia. We're talking 3rd millennia, 4th millennia BCE. So back when things were kind of fresh and new. And we're looking at the way they approached gods and how this evolved into what we have in Judeo-Christianity, in Islam, in all the religions that you see today that evolved from this. This is the cradle of civilization, they say. Even though the whole African take the rise of civilization out of Africa, still you have in Mesopotamia, the Euphrates River Valley, this whole area swinging down into the Middle East, known as the Fertile Crescent, that this was the cradle of civilization. This is where we have the first earmarks of written languages and this civilization as we understand it today. And back in the 4th millennium BCE, they saw God or gods or a divine presence as things that were expressed in nature. They were things that were already there. The rain, the stars, the sky, the wind, the water, the fire, the ground itself. All of these things were the natural gods. This is who God was, or the gods were. They were all these accumulated things, the god of the wind, the god of the fire, the god of the this, the god of the that. And it wasn't until the next millennia, the 3rd millennia BCE, when they started personalizing who God was. That God wasn't just the god of the mountain or the god of the thunder, that he was also the god of the heart. That pure paradox that says the unapproachable, all-powerful God is also the same God that is the God that cares about who I am. And so this is the progression, the evolution of religion and our understanding of God. And we left off last night talking about some of the different gods that were looked at, the basic 4 gods, and everything else evolved out of that. And we were talking about how there were a number of major Mesopotamian religious works that developed the concept of personal religion. And they were produced in the 2nd millennium BCE. Things like the story of Atrahasis, which we've talked about several times on this show, because I mention it very prominently when I wrote about the Nephilim. We talked about the similarity between the Genesis Garden of Eden story and the story of creation and the gods in the Mesopotamian accounts, which were some of them 1,500 to 2,000 years earlier than what we had recorded in biblical accounts. Now, the tale of Atrahasis. He was the human king, the king of the city of Eridu. And Eridu sat in the backwaters of the Euphrates River. And around them was what they called the Serpent's Marsh, because it was obviously named, aptly named, because it was filled with water serpents and things like snakes, things like that. And so, according to the story, Atrahasis the king pled to his god Enki and begged him to help deliver mankind, humanity, from the evil clutches of the gods, who were subjugating them, enslaving humanity, to dig their trenches, till their ground, mine their resources. And so Enki heard his plight. Enki, a brother to the gods, brother god, and he came down with his cohorts and helped Atrahasis fight against the gods and win their freedom. And for this, Enlil conscribed Enki to the subterranean caverns of the earth to dwell forever. And yet humanity gained its freedom. And this same story is reflected in the writings of Moses, talking about the Garden of Eden. We mentioned this yesterday. It's just worth recapping for the fun of it, the fun of the comparison. The Serpent's Marsh, where Enki would rise up from the great underground sea, the Abzu, and he would get in his boat, and his boatsmen would take him through the Serpent's Marsh. It was one of the favorite, if for a god, of his favorite places to go. And the Serpent's Marsh, because of Enki riding in his boat, Enki, also known as Ea, E-A is the way that's spelled, the god Ea, and Ea's Den is what it became known as. And Ea's Den eventually became the word Eden or Eden, which we find in the book of Genesis. And so you find all the other similarities in that story. So all of these religious works started to develop not just the major god or gods, but the relationship to the gods with human beings. Atrahasis' story focuses on the destructive capacity of the power of the gods, the Anunnaki, the Anu. And Atrahasis' response to this power is that man should increase his devotion to the gods and take care not to disturb them. Now, the Enuma Elish is another attempt to understand the universe. It does this by telling us how Marduk became king of the gods. And the story begins with the birth of successive generations of gods. One of the older gods, Apsu, a god of sweet water, the progenitor god, the creator god, rebels against the exuberant energy of the younger gods, which is their essence, but is defeated by Ea, Enki. And Tiamat, god of the salt waters, and also a progenitor, is then roused by an assembly of her children, and she too rebels. And the general assembly of the gods meets and confers kingship on Marduk, the state god of Babylonia. And Marduk defeats Tiamat, and then, by creating the universe, converts his temporary kingship into a permanent monarchy. Enuma Elish operates on many levels. It reflects the rise of the Babylonian as ruler over a united Babylonia, and it's an account of how the universe is ruled, and it explains how monarchy evolved. And according to Enuma Elish, the universe is grounded in divine power and divine will, and both nature and society are characterized by political order. Now you see how everything was was incredibly and thoroughly explained by giving the gods attributes that matched what happens on the earth, what happens in the universe, what happens to men. This is how they explained everything. And the third great Mesopotamian religious work is the Gilgamesh epic. And it's a magnificent humanistic tale based on the legends concerning a supposedly historical Gilgamesh. He was a ruler of Uruk, right around 2600 BCE. And the subject of the story is man's relationship to death. And the story contains two sets of legends. One recounts the valor of the historical Gilgamesh, and the other involves magical tales such as the death of Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the netherworld, both dealing with death. And as Jacobson, remember we talked about Thorkild Jacobson yesterday, who wrote this magnificent book and was one of the most, what's the adjective I want to give him? Renowned Assyriologists and Mesopotamianologists. I don't know if that's the word, but studies of Mesopotamia and Mesopotamian life, Mesopotamian religion and culture and civilization. And so Jacobson points out almost diametrically opposed attitudes towards death are reflected in both of these stories of Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the netherworld and the death of Gilgamesh. And in some, Gilgamesh seeks to avoid death. In the magical tales, however, Gilgamesh almost recklessly courts death. But death, nevertheless, remains the great unavoidable evil. And these antithetical attitudes are the theme of the epic, reflecting the development from an early disdain of death to an obsessive fear of death. And so when the story opens, Gilgamesh shares a heroic attitude of his time. He aspires to immortality through immortal fame. And when death takes his friend Enkidu, however, Gilgamesh begins to comprehend the reality of death and realizes that he himself also must die. And his previous value system collapses. His immortal fame now means nothing to him. He becomes obsessed instead with the quest for real immortality. And about 2,000 years later, you had Solomon writing in the book of Ecclesiastes, I've gained everything that it's possible to gain under the sun, and I found that all is vanity, all is emptiness, all is like the wind. And so that same reality set in on Solomon. So ultimately, Gilgamesh's ancestor, Utnapishtim, who is immortal, tells him the story of the flood to demonstrate that Utnapishtim's, boy, try to say these names over and over again. Imagine if you're living in the house and you're calling him for dinner. Utnapishtim, time to eat. Utnapishtim, scrape your plate off into the garbage. Utnapishtim, wash your dishes. Utnapishtim, time for chores. Utnapishtim, time for bed. Well, his ancestor, Utnapishtim, who's immortal, you can call him Tim for short, who is immortal, he tells the story of the flood to Gilgamesh to demonstrate that his own achievement of immortality was unique, and it's not available to Gilgamesh. And Utnapishtim then offers Gilgamesh a parting gift, the rejuvenating plant. But the plant is stolen from him by a serpent when Gilgamesh carelessly leaves it on the bank of a pool. And according to Jacobson, Gilgamesh's very lack of heroic stature brings him to his senses. He cannot defy his human nature. He must accept reality. Only the relative immortality of lasting achievement can be his, not eternal life. So for Jacobson, the second millennium was the high point of Mesopotamian religious achievement. And in his book, he devotes only a short epilogue to the first millennium, and these were disturbed times. Mesopotamia was invaded by the Armenians and the Sutu, and faced with possibility of sudden death, Mesopotamian society reflected an increased interest in the powers of death and in the netherworld, and stories about them became increasingly popular. And the religious outlook reflected the turmoil and increasing brutalization of the times. And so the gods of political enemies themselves became enemies and were treated as such in ritual in which these gods were maimed and killed. But even in the first millennium, the three major metaphors that Jacobson discerns in Mesopotamian thought survived. God as a provider, that's the fourth millennium. God as a ruler in the third millennium. And God as a parent in the second millennium. God as provider was an official in charge of his beneficent phenomena of nature. And the ruler metaphor justified the trend toward absolutism in early kingship, these kings becoming actual gods or sons of gods. And the parent metaphor continued to flourish, not only in the penitential psalms, "O God, take pity on me, your servant, for I am sinful and loathful, and rise me back up." So those penitential psalms and the rites of contrition, but in the idea of quietistic piety as well. So thus the torch of Mesopotamian religion was passed on. And it was passed on to what we have experienced even today in a much more, I'm not using this term in a negative sense, but in the watered down religions we have of today. They have become the offspring of all of this early religion. So you can see the evolution of religion. You can see how it became what it is today. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily Jehovah becoming Jehovah, or Jesus becoming Jesus and deified in Christianity. I'm not talking about that as much as I'm talking about the structure of religion, how it came from worshiping the gods of the cosmos down to them becoming the personal gods, the Abba fathers, those that we attach to on a personal level. And so you can see that evolution. And something else I want us to kind of bend over to and take a look at is this idea of the sons of God, the ideology of the Assyrian kingship, and how this played into religion, the impact of all this Mesopotamian religious thought on the evolution of other ancient religions and philosophical thought has never been seriously investigated to great depths. And what follows are some forays into this uncharted territory, and I suspect the influence has been far greater than anyone has yet suggested, as everything we talked about today so far, and all in yesterday's show, the influence of the ancient religions and how it evolved into what we have now. Take, for example, one small datum. There was a commandment to refrain from work and travel on the 7th day of each month, plus the 19th day. Whether this had any effect on the Israelite commandment to refrain from work and travel on the 7th day, I'm not really sure. It may be simply coincidence, or there may be some relationship between these prohibitions. So from the ancient Mesopotamian to the Israelite in Canaan, you find some gross similarities. Now, a more substantial matter is the Mesopotamian sense of the king as the son of God. And as we're going to see here, some of the similarities to later religious concepts are rather striking. In the popular imagination, Assyrian kings have long been portrayed as despots of the worst possible kind, spending their time when not engaging in war or other cruelties in their harems, immersed in bodily pleasures and revelries. There's a famous painting by Eugene Delacroix, The Death of Sardanapalus. The death of Sardanapalus. You know, you read these names, you never really have to speak them all that much. Sardanapalus. Now, here an atmosphere of depraved luxury is suggested in the disgusting portrait of this great Assyrian king, which was the late 7th century BCE. And so you're talking, I want to see, by the way, if I've got this picture here, which I did not load up. So give me a second here. Those of you watching the video, I'm gonna show you this particular image. and we're going to, I gotta open it all up and download it here into my program so you can see it. Let's see, hang on here a second. We'll do this. I know that this is not riveting radio, as I've said before, listening to me talk about this kind of thing. But let me save this, and we're going to put it right here so we can find it, Delacroix. And I want you to see this image. This is the way they depicted this particular king. So let's put this image in here. We'll just call it Delacroix because it's easier to spell than the other dude's name. Let's see. I'm going to browse for it here, and talk amongst yourselves for a second while I do this. I think you'll enjoy this. Okay, here it is, by the way. If you are watching the video, now there's the king. I've got to make this fit, so you got to deal with it here for just a second as I struggle to resize this image. And you can see the utter debauch of the king here. Well, let's just bring it all down like that. There we go. All right. Now, this is the painting by Delacroix. Now, take a look at that for a second, and you can see what we're talking about here. This is the imagination, the popular imagination of the Assyrian kings. They were the worst kinds of despots. They spent their time warring and being cruel to people, and when they weren't doing that, they were in their harems, immersed in bodily pleasures and revelries. And it's suggested in the disgusting portrait of this last great Assyrian king, which would be the late 7th century BCE. And so the picture of Assyrian kingship that emerges from a study of the documents left by the Assyrians themselves, however, is far different than what you see depicted here, or what the perception was. To the Assyrians, a king immersed in revelries and cruelties would have been an abomination. Their kingship was a sacred institution, rooted in heaven. Their king was the model of human perfection, as seen as a prerequisite, really, for man's personal salvation. And so the heavenly origin of kingship is already attested in the earliest Mesopotamian cultures. And so this kind of depiction of who the king was and what the king did and the kind of debauch that he lived in is really not an accurate picture of who the king was, according to the Assyrians. And so the heavenly origin of kingship is already attested in the earliest Mesopotamian cultures. And so we're going to pick this up. I just noticed we are out of time in this first segment, so you all sit tight. We're going to be right back, and we'll pick this up where we left off. sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you've heard that about 300 times, so you should be able to almost recite what I'm telling you now by rote. So go on over to Odyssey Radio, see all the goodness that's on Odyssey Radio, and at the same time, come on over to the YouTube channel, where you can watch the video simulcast of this show. The first segment was demonstrative of a little bit of what we can do over with the video channel. Not only did you just get to stare at my ugly mug for an hour a night, but you get to see some of the pictures we throw up. Now, we don't do that every day and in every show, but it's a fun way to get the message across sometimes. And so come on over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts and join the live chat room going on right now, filled with Intrepheads that are talking about a whole host of different kinds of things and also contributing to this show. So come on over, enjoy yourself over there. Would love to have you. And while you're there, subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the little bell icon that'll give you notifications of when the show hits the air every day. Same time, same channel, 5 nights a week. So we're talking about right now, we've shifted a bit from Mesopotamian religion as the basis, the evolution, the beginning of the evolutionary inverted pyramid, if you will, that leads down to where we are today. In religion, the way we practice, the way we view God or the gods. And now looking at how the kingship in ancient Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, all these ancient kings that we think of, how the kingship became really a picture of the Son of God. How the king, the monarch himself, became the Son of God. And or even gods themselves in Egypt, if you look at ancient Egypt. And so, to the Assyrians, a king who was, as we mentioned, immersed in the revelries and cruelties would have been an abomination. Their kingship was a sacred institution. It was part of their religious and their spiritual practice. The king was to be a model of the gods. And their king was a model also of human perfection, seen as a prerequisite for man's personal salvation. And so the heavenly origin of kingship is already attested in the earliest Mesopotamian cultures. In both Sumerian and Babylonian mythology, it's expressed allegorically, with the image of a tree planted upon the earth by the mother goddess Inanna, who is also known as, we talked about Inanna yesterday, she's also Ishtar later. The sacred tree, usually represented in the form of a stylized palm tree growing on a mountain, is the most common decorative motif in Assyrian royal iconography. It occurs in imperial architecture. It appeared on seals and weapons of the ruling elite. It appeared on jewelry and elsewhere on the walls of the palace of the king Ashurbanipal II in 883 to 859 BCE in Kalu, which is modern Nimrud, were covered with more than 400 representations of this sacred tree. And so the most elaborate rendition of the tree motif in this palace occurs on a relief placed directly behind the royal throne. The tree appears under a winged solar disk of Ashur, the supreme god of the empire. The symbol of the highest god hovering over the tree marks it as a cosmic tree, growing on the axis mundi and connecting heaven and earth. And it's flanked by 2 representations of Ashurbanipal II, depicted as the ideal king. And this enigmatic tree thus stood in the center of the Assyrian Empire, the middle point of the world from the ideological point of view. And the cosmic nature of the tree is implied by its elaborate structure, absolute symmetry, and axial balance, as well as by the overall composition of the relief itself. And the flanking figures forcing the viewer's attention toward the center and thence to the winged disc above. And I want to see, I didn't look this up again ahead of time, So, looking at Ashurbanipal II and his seal. Let's see if I can find this. Relief seal sacred tree. I'm going to see if I can find a good image of this for you. And if I do, I'll flash it up there for those of you who are in the chat room and over on the YouTube channel. Let's see. Yeah, I know this is familiar. You have seen this before in different depictions. It's also, by the way, this tree was known as the Tree of Knowledge as well. And where have we heard that one before? Let's take a look at this this image. This might be good enough to show you exactly what I'm talking about here, of this sacred tree with the winged god above it. And I'm going to save this image right here. And we will, this is the Anunnaki gods. This is where you have seen this before. And this is an image from Iran. And let's take a peek at it here. I'm going to put this in here. And the image is of Ashurbanipal II. Let's grab it here so you can... here it is. Boom. You've seen this before, I know. There it is, folks. Now, if you're in the chat room and you're looking at this, this is what we're talking about with this sacred palm tree, the perfect symmetry, the images of Ashurbanipal on both sides. And so this is exactly what we were talking about here, is that, and this would be on the walls of the palace. And it was the symbol of the highest god hovering over the tree, marks it as the cosmic tree that's growing on the axis mundi, connecting heaven with earth. And this shows the flanking figures of Ashurbanipal are forcing the viewer's attention toward the center, and thence to the winged disk above, which is the highest of gods. And so a cosmic tree growing in the middle of the world and connecting heaven with earth was the best imaginable visual symbol for the king's pivotal position as both the focal point of the imperial system and the sole representative of God upon the earth. So when seated on his throne, the king, from the viewpoint of the people present in the throne room, merged with the tree, thus becoming, as it were, its human incarnation. And this idea is implicit in the 4th chapter of the biblical book of Daniel. Remember Daniel the prophet, Daniel in the lion's den? You remember that story? And this is the story in which the king of Babylon dreams of a huge oak, a huge tree growing in the middle of the earth. Its top reaches the sky, and it's told by the prophet Daniel, that tree, O king, is you. You know, it might be worth, while we're looking at this image, let's take a look at this particular passage in the book of Daniel. Let's see if we can find it here. This would be Daniel 41, or I'm sorry, Daniel 4, verses 10 through 22. Let's see if it lets me get there. I'm trying to look this up for you so we can read this. All right, there we go. Daniel 10, 4, 10 through 22. Goes like this. Now, this is the New International Version of the Bible, not the King James. Goes like this. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, "Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means. And this is the name they gave Daniel, Belteshazzar. Tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, this brings back some imagery of Joseph in Egypt, doesn't it? And it says, and then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a long time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies, and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds, your majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. And now that is the dream. Now there's more to that dream, and we can talk here. Let me turn off this picture for those of you in the chat room watching the video. This was the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And the prophecy in the dream was that the tree was cut down. The stump was left with bands of bronze put around it. And so the rest of the dream is where Daniel, Belteshazzar, tells Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to go mad. You're going to be cut down. You're going to live with the animals. And you're going to be like a wild man for 7 years. And according to the story, this is what happened. And according to the dream, it was so that Nebuchadnezzar would see that God is sovereign amongst all, sovereign of the universe and sovereign amongst men. And this is what happens in the biblical account. So the king's association with the cosmic tree, while part and parcel of Assyrian royal ideology, was inherited from earlier Mesopotamian empires. Several Sumerian kings of the Ur-3 dynasty. Remember Ur? U-R? This comes from Uruk. Ur was remember Ur of the Chaldees, which is where Abraham was called out of his priesthood to become the father of the Jewish nation, or of the Israelite nation. And so this is about 2000 BC, by the way, where all these kings of the Ur-3 dynasty are referred to in contemporary texts as palm trees, or mes trees, MES-trees, growing along abundant watercourses. And in the Babylonian Epic of Era, E-R-R-A, the mes tree is said to reach by its roots the bottom of the underworld, and by its top the heaven of Anu, thus leaving no doubt about its identification as the cosmic tree. So representing the king as the personification of the cosmic tree not only emphasized this unique position and power that he holds, but it also served to underline this whole divine origin of kingship. And so, as already noted, the cosmic tree had been planted in the world by the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, who elsewhere figures as the divine mother of the king. In Assyrian imperial art, the goddess nurses the king as a baby, or a child, small child, and the message conveyed was that the king was identical in essence to his divine mother, in keeping with this idea of essential identity, or consubstantially, the goddess too is identified with the date palm in Assyrian texts. And now, it's a little bit of a stretch to reach this, but you can see where this came from when you see When we talked about Moses, we talked about Senenmut, this bust of this guy back here. Senenmut, the name given him by the queen Hatshepsut, the queen pharaoh. She renamed Senenmut, whatever his original name was, probably Moses. She renames him Senenmut, which means mother's brother. I, your mother, stepmother in this case, I, your mother, I, the queen, the embodiment, I, the pharaoh, the embodiment of the gods, am bestowing on you kinship to me. You have become, I'm elevating you to brother. Senenmut is mother's brother, elevating you to that status. That status. This is essentially the same thing. So since the human king, in contrast to the gods, was made of flesh and blood, this has to be understood spiritually. It didn't reside in his physical, but in his spiritual nature. That is, in his psyche, in his soul. He thus was an entity composed of both matter and divine essence. And this sounds very like the doctrine of homoousis, enunciated at the Council of Nicaea in 325 under Constantine the Emperor, in which Jesus is said to be of the same substance as the Father. Homoousios in the Greek, as the Father. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the eponymous hero was a perfect king, and he was 2/3 God and 1/3 man. According to Christianity, Jesus, who is the king of the coming kingdom, that he is perfectly 100% God, 100% man, entwined, not even entwined, all embodied and blended into one. So he was, they said that there was a word called the kenosis, the emptying of himself. They say when God stooped down to become a man in the form of the baby in the womb of the Virgin Mary, that he gave up his godness, his godhood, to become human, but that he was also in nature, spiritual nature, both God and man. So it's that same thinking that's evolved down through the ages. You could look at it if Joyce is here in the chat room. She was here last night. We talked about Gnosticism. We've talked on this show about Gnostic mysticism and how that the God-man came into being. The God-man as Messiah type existed long before the story of Jesus. And Jesus then fulfilled all the same points. And his followers, who would have been followers of the divine mystic Gnosticism, made sure all these points matched in his story. So, and of course, the literalists won out. The literalist Orthodox Church won out over the mysticism of the Gnostics. So, going on, Ishtar is the divine mother of the king. She was the wife of Ashur, the supreme god of the empire. She was defined in Assyrian sources as the sum total of gods and the only true god. Ashur was thus, by implication, the heavenly father of the king. And while the latter was his son, the king, in human form, the father, mother, son triad, constituted by Ashur, Ishtar, and the king, reminds one of the Holy Trinity of Christianity, where the Son, according to Athanasius, is the self-same Godhead as the Father, but that Godhead manifested rather than immanent. So the notion of the king as the... Sorry, I keep hitting my ring on my coffee cup. That's what you're hearing. It's great radio. The notion of the king as the Son of God held true only insofar as it referred to the divine spirit that resided within his body. In Mesopotamian mythology, this divine spirit takes the form of a celestial savior figure, Ninurta, and whose mythological role as the Assyrian kings consciously emulated both in ritual and daily life. The Ninurta myth is known in numerous versions, but in its essence, it's the story of the victory of light over the forces of darkness and death. And in all its versions, Ninurta, the son of the divine king, sets out from his celestial home to fight the evil forces that threaten his father's kingdom. He proceeds against the mountain or the foreign land, and he meets the enemy, defeats the enemy, and then returns in triumph to his celestial home, where he's blessed by his father and his mother. He's exalted at their side, and Ninurta becomes an omnipotent cosmic accountant of men's fates. And it is this that the Assyrian kings emulated. And by the way, in this whole triune trinity thing, you see Ashur, the god, you see Ishtar, or Inanna, you see these two mixed with the king as being this triune godhead, and where we get the idea of trinity. Well, if you've got the God with God, and you've got the Son with Jesus, who is then the female, the mother, Ashur? Well, that would be the Holy Spirit. That's how they depicted her. And so it's not difficult to recognize this whole idea. Exalted at their side, Ninurta becomes this omnipotent cosmic accountant of men's fates. And this is who the Son of God is. And it's not difficult to recognize that in this myth is the archetype of Christian dogma, the elevation of the Christ to the right hand of his Father as the judge over the living and the dead. The figure of Ninurta also recalls that of the archangel Michael, the great prince, the slayer of the dragon, the holder of the celestial keys in Jewish apocalyptic and apocryphal traditions. And so traditionally, the perfect king as Ninurta incarnate was the perfect likeness of God, who shared all the attributes of the Godhead. Like Ashur, he was omnipotent, omniscious, profoundly wise, prudent, perfectly just, and immortal, invisible, God only wise. Remember that song? It's a hymn from Christianity. Isn't it removed from our eyes? Something like that. I can't remember all the words. But that's what came to mind right there. The omnipotent, omniscient, profoundly wise, prudent, perfectly just, merciful, all love, glorious, and superbly strong and holy was Ashur. So like the Pauline Christ, this is the Christ that Paul gives us in the New Testament, he also metaphysically encompassed the whole universe, symbolized by the cosmic tree. In short, he was God in human form, the perfect man, the only person possibly fit to rule the world as God's earthly representative. As a semi-divine being, he alone of all human beings was surrounded by divine radiance, or melamu, the outward sign of divine perfection. Doesn't that sound like the Jesus put forward in the New Testament by the writings of mostly of Paul? This is where that idea came from. So and I know that's going to fly in the face of what some people believe about Jesus. Is Jesus the Son of God? Does he encapsulate all of God mixed with all of humanity in one? Is he omniscient, omnipresent, all-knowing, everywhere at once, all-wise? Is this who he is? This is who the New Testament says he is. And this is exactly what the Assyrian kings were under the god Ashur and the goddess Ishtar. So the Assyrian ideal of royal perfection is not elaborated in terms of Aristotelian logic, but it's expressed only through metaphors, allegories, symbolic imagery. So in order to understand it, we have to see through the symbols and the images by which it's expressed. The most important of these is the sun, the primary symbol of the supreme god Ashur, and the blinding brilliance of its disk, just like Ra in Egyptian mythology. Is the blinding brilliance of the sun is symbolized the absolute purity, holiness, righteousness of God as opposed to the darkness of the world. You are the light of the world, O Lord, broken to set us free. So how can there be any darkness in me, since you are the light of the world? You are the light of the world. This is what we learned in Christian church. That's one of the songs that just came to mind. It just popped into my head. This is the same thing we're seeing here. Absolute purity, holiness, righteousness of God, as opposed to the darkness of the world, associated with evil, ignorance, injustice, and death. The sun's unwavering, absolutely straight path across the skies, its merciless heat, and the triumphant return of light after the winter solstice symbolized God's irresistible victory over wickedness and evil. Finally, the eternal return of the seasons symbolized the eternity of God and kingship as a divine institution eternally regenerating itself, notwithstanding the bodily death of the king. So in Assyrian royal ideology, the king is often referred to as the sun, or the very image of Shamash, the sun god. And the word king was commonly written with a sacred number of the sun god, 20. Now, it was, of course, patently clear to everybody close to the king that whatever his spiritual condition, he was physically human and thus subject to all the weaknesses and all the imperfections of humankind: disease, bodily injury, misbehavior, imperfect memory and reasoning, error of judgment, faulty decisions, miscalculations, flaws of all sorts, and, of course, even physical death. And so the fragility of the human component of the king was duly recognized and accepted as an inevitability. However, it could not be tolerated. The king's body was viewed as a temple erected by God himself and the worldly residence of the divine spirit. So, like a temple of stone, eventually worn and stained by dust and smoke and rain and fire and other agents, it was subject to the constant influence of the elements: pollution, decay, old age. But just as it was unworthy for the image of God to reside in a dirty or dilapidated temple, it was inconceivable that the Spirit of God, synonymous with purity, chastity, wisdom, light, and perfection, could have resided in a filthy and foul body. It was essential that any stains and defects observed in the king's body and comportment be immediately removed and amended, just as the disk of the sun would soon return to its pristine glory and beauty after an eclipse. If not, the divine spirit would depart from the king's body, leaving behind just an empty shell. And tomorrow we're going to pick up with this idea of the perfect king. We're going to talk about the whole kingship of the Son of God, and how that became what it was, and how we see it in, of course, as we've already seen a bit today, brought down evolutionarily speaking, through religion, anthropologically speaking, down from the earliest of times to where we are today. And so keep your faith strong, know what you believe. Also, I hope you're enjoying this information. It can get a little thick, it's history, but this is the beauty of studying history. It sheds the light on a lot of things. So, folks, thanks for being here. We're going to take a 23-hour break, and we'll be back. So you sit tight. Have a good night.